On this Veterans Day, we respectfully salute all of those who fought and died for their nation. We thank you for your service. Tonight, we're honored to have Emmy-winning TV host and longtime political reporter Rita Cosby give us her perspective on our current state of election limbo. And this week, we heard some promising developments about a possible COVID-19 vaccine, but how will it change our lives? So, Rita, most Americans would probably have preferred an election with a clear winner, even if their party didn't come out on top. But instead, we're in this limbo where the entire electoral process is going under the microscope. We've got 4 states where the margin of victory is less than 0.75%. That includes Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and in Georgia, where Biden's leading by just 0.28%. And today, a manual recount was announced. We're joined by 3-time Emmy Award-winning host and longtime political reporter Rita Cosby. And you were there 20 years ago for Bush v. Gore, and you were on the steps of the Supreme Court when that decision came down. So I'd love to get your perspective on what parallels you see or don't see between these 2 elections.
Well, you know, it's so interesting, Cindy, and it's wonderful to be with you and all of your viewers. I do feel a lot of flashbacks to 2000, when, of course, I was there when that big decision came down, and I followed it every step of the way, even leading up to that decision. And that's why you hit it on the head, that there are now more than 70 million Americans who voted for President Trump who are saying, what happened? And I can promise you, as someone who did cover the 2000 election, that if the shoe were on the other foot today, the Democrats would absolutely be crying foul. And they certainly did in 2000. And I think in 2000, in terms of differences, there was just a zeroing in of particular counties, and specifically Palm Beach County, as we look at in Florida. That was in 2000, where Gore's team came in and said, hey, wait a minute, let's do a recount. Let's check to see the, quote, hanging chads, remember, which we learned so much about. Which ones do get counted, which ones don't get counted. It did, of course, as we know, go back to the Supreme Court several times during different steps of the way. So it's quite a lengthy process. And there it is that night when I was there in 2000, when the actual decision came down. And then the Supreme Court at that point ruled in favor of George W. Bush, making him the president. So there's similarities in terms of the different steps, and that there is contention, that there's legal steps. The differences, of course, are the fact that the Trump team right now, as you just talked about, they're looking at multiple states, and they have to actually, their goal is to try to reverse the outcome in multiple states. And that is a lot more complex. It's a lot more lengthy. There are different issues in different states. And I think, as you pointed out just now, Cindy, that a lot of it comes to Georgia specifically. Of course, there will be 2 Senate runoffs, so the power of the Senate is also up for contention there. But now with the word that there will be an official manual recount of the paper ballots, that's where it could get interesting to see what do they uncover in Georgia that could possibly, and again, it's a big if at this point, but could it possibly change the results in Georgia? And could it show something systematic that could help them in issues in other states that they are contending as well?
So that's, from your point of view, basically what they're going to have to prove, that there's something systematic, not just a collection of irregularities that add up to something. Is that right?
Well, it could be a collection of irregularities because it could differ from state to state. And that's why they have to take each state, because as we know, all the different states have different rules, as we've seen, which is what has made it so complex and so confusing. And that's why I think so many Americans right now are just kind of going, well, what happened and where is this going? And this has been such an unusual election too, Cindy. And that's why I think there are so many different things that they're going after, because never before in American history have we seen such a voluminous amount of the mail-in ballots in states that were not doing it before, and certainly not to this degree. And of course, it's because of COVID and all the different circumstances surrounding that. But it's definitely made the election process much more complex, much more convoluted, much more confusing for Americans. And even Republicans that were just surveyed recently, and I wasn't surprised by this number, I actually thought it might even be higher. They're in a number of polls saying that at least 70% of Republicans are saying, yeah, there's something that needs to be looked into. And even I'm an independent. I'm a registered independent. And I have friends on both sides of the aisle. I've had Democratic friends that have said to me, yeah, it should be looked at because it was just such a weird thing. At one point, it clearly looked in many states that Trump was ahead, and then it changed with, of course, of the mail-in ballots, but the different standards in different states. And so what they have to prove is that they have to show either, as we talked about, there's something systemic, and that's one of the things they're looking at. They're alleging, and again, it's just an allegation at this point, but they're alleging in Michigan in particular that there was a glitch, and that glitch, they say, went for thousands of votes that went for Biden that should have gone for Trump. They did acknowledge apparently there was some issue. Some people are saying it may have been a manual, it may have been a human error as opposed to a glitch. But if they could show there was something wrong with the software there that was also used in other states, that could be very interesting, of course.
Right.
But if they don't get that, they're going to have to go state by state. And in Pennsylvania, say, wait a minute, these ballots should not have counted after 8 o'clock on election eve, that the state Supreme Court stepped in. They should not have done it. They should have relied on the legislature. In Georgia, they can go after other things. But the thing is, who knows what they uncover? The election process, there's always been allegations of fraud, Cindy, but it's never really been under the microscope like it is right now, widespread to the degree. So it's going to be interesting to see what they uncover.
So I want to get back to that in a minute, but first I want to ask you, as a veteran political reporter, what do you think is the media's role in all this? Because to be honest, it's one of the things that's also super confusing about this election, is that the media called the election, not any official body, and so different media are now concluding different things. So what should be the role of the media in calling or determining a winner in the election? Have we given them unwittingly too much power over the years?
That's a great question. That's a fabulous question, because as we saw in this particular election, some media were calling particular states, other ones were calling different states, where you're like, okay, well, which one today? And it wasn't even just within hours. I've covered so many elections through the years, and sometimes, somebody will make the call and then there's a wait of a few minutes. But the fact that it's been such a long wait and there's been such a variance in which states are called by which media, I do think that after all of this, there will be a lot of soul searching in terms of, first of all, not even just the media, but let's go back to even before that, Cindy. Let's talk about the polling, because the pre-election polling showed that Trump was going to lose by a huge landslide, and that it looked like it was going to be called, pretty soon after the polls were closed. Well, that didn't happen, as we know. So I think that there's so many people that have to sort of reevaluate. And I knew that this election would be tight. I mean, I just had this gut just because I talked to so many average Americans. And what happened is a lot of the pollsters are not getting the correct information, because people aren't saying whether or not they're voting for Trump. They're reluctant. The sort of silent Trump vote, I do believe, is still out there. But also, I just think that many of the media went in looking at those polls and relying those polls. And many of them should have realized that they were so way off in 2016, and that could absolutely happen again, as we have seen in 2020. There wasn't this huge blue wave, even in the House seats. And certainly in the Senate seats, as we're looking at it. In fact, the Republicans gained seats, as we know, in the House. So there's a lot of soul searching and a lot of reevaluating. And I think there'll be a lot of pollsters who may be out of a job very soon. And I think the media has to look at how much weight they give to that, and also realize that when you're dealing with mail-in ballots and dealing with the Trump factor, which has just been such an unusual candidate and unusual presidency, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. It's not the traditional route that they've so much relied on for so many years.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what sort of soul searching there is after 2016. I think it lasted about 5 days, and then we all forgot about it. So
that's true.
We'll see what happens this time. What do you make, actually, of the media coverage of what's been going on, and maybe how it compared to 2000?
Well, I do think there's clearly always been a media bias against President Trump. And I do think a number of them have just sort of like almost avoided that they're even contesting this presidency. And the way I feel very strongly that if a candidate, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, and given the circumstances of, again, all these votes coming in the middle of the night, and we'll see, maybe many of them are legal. Maybe I'm sure there is some fraud. There clearly are cases where people who are dead that voted or should not have voted. I mean, there's so many of these. That always happens every election. The question is, does it rise enough to change the votes or show a systemic problem in the voting process? And I think so many in the media have just sort of moved on and not even given the attention to say, wait a minute, let's step back. Let's also look at history. And as you point out, let's look at 2000, because as we know, Gore first conceded, then he took away his concession. And then the media was following it every step of the way, saying, okay, let's look at this, let's look at this. And I think we have to give it a fair shot. And I say that also, Cindy, because here it is, it's Veterans Day. And you and I both share, obviously, a love of history and a love of Poland and appreciation in your incredible family. And in my family, my father was a freedom fighter in Poland. And at a very young age, he decided to stay and fight. The Germans invaded. Then, as we know, of course, communism took over Poland. And my father was rescued by American troops in World War II. And when my father came to America, he said, I want to come to this incredible country called America. And so I say that because so much is at stake now. Our integrity, the way that we're seen in the world, and Americans, whether you voted for President Trump or you didn't, you need to feel good about the election process. You need to feel that this was fair, that this was free elections, that this is a country that puts integrity and legal votes and the priority on the process. The process is much bigger than any American, much bigger than any candidate. And I think Americans deserve that. And I think any campaign, and I would say that if it was on the other side too, because it's been such an unusual election. And maybe there may be something that changes the election and President Trump stays in office. I think he's got a very high bar from a legal perspective that he has to reach because it's multiple states. But also, who knows what uncovers that shows systematic problems in the election process that whether it changes the vote or not, it may reflect and do changes in the election process in general for elections to come. If there is fraud, that needs to be revealed no matter how big or how small that is.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting from that point of view. When you take the long view, what are the long-term impacts of all of this? So we're going to have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but since this is Veterans Day, as you pointed out, and I know the cause of those in service is very near and dear to your heart, and tomorrow you've got an event going. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and because I do appreciate so much those of service, I'm now the chair of the great Global Service Institute. It's at Long Island University, and it is a global institute. And tomorrow at noon Eastern time, and it's free and open to the public, we have different speakers all the time. And tomorrow we've got a great one. We have the Israeli Prime Minister, the former one, Ehud Olmert, and it's at noon. And again, it's free, it's virtual. Everyone watching, you can just register. That's all you have to do. You go to globalserviceinstitute.org, globalserviceinstitute.org. And Israel is a really interesting country, Cindy, as you know, and your viewers know, because they have 2 years mandatory military service. Some do civic service, but primarily it's military service. They have a real value of giving back to the nation, of feeling in touch and appreciating the values of their country, and also, of course, the alliance between you and Israel. And I will certainly be asking him what Israel thinks of our presidential election and the processes that have been continuing and everything we've talked about. But definitely everybody sign up. It's globalserviceinstitute.org. It is free, and a chance to also ask questions. We also open it up to viewers to ask questions of the former prime minister. So it's a really neat opportunity and a way to be able to shine a light on service around the globe.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back.
Anytime. My pleasure. Thanks so much, Cindy.
Thank you, Rita. Bye-bye. And coming up after the break, there's big news about a potential COVID-19 vaccine, but what will that look like? But first, here's America Q&A.
No, sir. No, sir. Nah, I didn't even bother to even get, involved in it.
Oh my gosh. The first day on Tuesday definitely was hopeful, and then things started to go not the way that I was hoping, and then couldn't sleep all of Tuesday night going into Wednesday. To relieve the stress, I guess trying to go outside, spending time with my family. I'm staying at my brother's and cooking dinner with them, just and doing things off of my screens as much as I can, even though I get a little addicted to them at times, refreshing Google every 10 seconds.
There was definitely a lot of tension as far as a lot of anger, both parties being angry at each other, depending on where you came from. But Yeah, I could say that was the majority of the stress. Yeah.
How I dealt with it, lots of prayer. I prayed and I come and I walk to get some stress off. So that's how I handled it.
I pray Almighty.
Essentially talk about the weather with.
To be honest, not in healthy ways. I was dabbling in some narcotics, and which is not the healthiest way to cope, but
And welcome back. On Monday, Pfizer and its German partner BioNTech announced that it had preliminary results for a vaccine that's more than 90% effective. That sounds like good news, since we've all been told by many experts that life can't return to normal without an effective vaccine. But before we start tossing away our masks, there's still a lot of medical unknowns and ultimately a lot of social policy decisions to be made. How will life change with a vaccine, and what will the new normal look like? To help us answer those questions, we have with us today James Sapirstein, CEO of Azurrx Biopharma Inc, and Clara Del Villar, healthcare policy analyst with FreedomWorks. James, Clara, welcome.
Thank you.
So, thanks for coming. So, James, I'd like to start with you. We've seen a lot of headlines with the good news, but that doesn't tell the whole story. There's a lot more behind it. Can you tell us what some of the things that we need to be aware of before we get too excited are?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank you for having me on the program as well as our guest, and thanks to the veterans for keeping us safe. So the 90% efficacy rate from the Pfizer vaccine is certainly great news. We expect other vaccines to come along as well, which will have similar rates as well. But it's based on the distribution of the Pfizer vaccine and its ultra cold distribution packaging. It's going to take quite a bit of time to get the vaccine out there. I would expect that you're not going to see full distribution to the American public until second or third quarter of next year. In the meantime, there'll be other vaccines that will be introduced. Unfortunately, none of these will be a permanently preventative vaccine, at least not yet, to the type of vaccines that you know of with smallpox or even the recent shingles vaccine, which inoculates you for life, pretty much. This is going to be more or less like the flu vaccine. You're going to have to take it every single year. And the Pfizer vaccine is 2 injections, spaced out by 21 days. Hopefully the next vaccines that come afterwards will be a little better, maybe one injection, maybe 2, but a little bit tightly packed.
And Clara, they haven't tested this on everybody yet, right? It's not tested on children, or what do we not know in terms of who it works for?
That's absolutely true. There's been some demographic composition in the study, but really we're talking about 94. There were basically 94 patients in the study, and essentially the Pfizer has indicated that they will not be applying for emergency use authorization until they've really completed the safety checks for the remaining half of patients that are now involved with the second dose of this vaccine. So they're actually hoping the safety procedures will be completed by the end of November, hopefully in the next 10 days, and they can start planning a rollout. But there are many issues that are still unknown. It's not clear how long the immunization of the vaccine lasts. Is it 2 months? Is it 1 year, 2 years, lifetime? And it's really not clear that a patient may not still be able to carry the COVID illness and transmit it. So there are quite a lot of unknowns.
So one of the things I opened with is how this might change our lives. We've all been told life gets to go back to normal once we have a vaccine, but it seems like if we don't know how long it's good for, about transmission in children, are we expecting, James, to see things change very much initially?
Well, great question. I think the announcement that was missed during the Pfizer announcement was the fact that Eli Lilly was authorized for emergency use with their antibody product as well. So that was very good news because that's one of the many therapeutics that's being looked at to treat patients. And that means that not as opposed to the beginning of the pandemic where COVID was being looked at pretty much as a death sentence if you got yourself into the hospital. Now there's one, two, maybe three or four therapeutics that are available, and these protocols that are available that can help people survive this. So I think that's one big step closer to normalization. I would agree we still need to use our masks. The masks are still going to be as prevalent as before, and even more important even while we have the vaccine until we understand the vaccine is useful. But the therapeutics, along with the vaccines, are getting us closer to normalization.
All right, well, that's good to hear. Clara, there was a Gallup poll at the end of July that found about 35% of people wouldn't be willing to take a vaccine, even an FDA-approved one, even if it's free. And that number actually jumped to 30 or 50% the last time they did the Gallup poll, which was in October. Why do you think that is? And do you think there will be calls to make the vaccine mandatory?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think for the most part, a lot of people didn't realize that the COVID doesn't go away and that it's continuing. And as the cases started to surge, perhaps that created some fear that a vaccine may be somehow potent in some way. But I think a couple of things will help the public feel a little more comfortable in that Dr. Fauci came out recently and actually yesterday or today basically saying he would take the vaccine. I think if you have some senior level officials basically reiterate the safety, the safeguards that have been applied in this, vaccine, I think there's a lot more information coming out as to how the vaccine was developed, even though it's basically been historically a historic time frame between identifying the disease and actually coming up with a vaccine. So I think as more and more information becomes available to the public, and as we get into 2021, I think I see people's perhaps anxiety level decrease as the emergency use authorization begins and people get applied with the vaccine.
But do you think they'll make it mandatory or try to?
I would doubt that would happen. Again, it's really difficult for the federal, I think, and James may have a view on this, but I think that would probably be difficult to do. And we're between administrations at this stage. Again, I think it's more of a state by state rollout. By the way, there are also a couple of other pharmas that will be releasing their vaccine. They're in late stage trials, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. So I think with the whole influx of vaccines and the safety procedures probably identified will make the public feel much more at ease as the months go by.
So I wanted to get into, again, back to how life may change or not. So there was just an article that Ticketmaster would tie its ticketing to your identity, and you can, go into a venue if you're vaccinated or tested negative in the last 3 days. You can imagine this expanding to other things like maybe getting on the subway, going into a restaurant. What do you think, in some ways this is good in terms of opening up businesses again, but in other ways it can feel a bit big brother, and I can imagine a lot of people not being happy with that sort of situation. So James, what do you see as the future as, let's say, we have a vaccine that we can use?
Well, for good or for bad, I've got a lot of friends in the entertainment business, and I think this is one particular business that's really suffering, both from the sports and the music and all of these. I've got a lot of friends who are out of work. So I think everyone's trying to devise a plan on how to get back to work. I agree, it sounds very big brotherish, but there are ways to keep patient identifiers private and not break the HIPAA foundation that's been established in this country. The problem is if you put this information, say, on an app on a phone or something to that sort, people can switch phones around while they're in line. There's a whole lot of things that can be done. As you know, there are a lot of other devices on the market, right, that diabetics use for glucose testing and things of that sort that can be modified to carry this information as well. All sorts of things are being worked on and developed. The bottom line is we have to come up with some kind of strategy to keep people safe. There's no reason why people can't go to some arenas spread out. We're seeing it in the NFL right now where some people, they're selling less tickets, but some people can go into the arenas. There's other venues that are being created moving forward. I don't know that the vaccine is going to come out fast enough or be distributed fast enough in 2021 to really make a difference. But I think we need to think of different alternatives that can identify folks, and that could be from taking temperatures as people walk through the door. You have airport screening material that are used in some airports, which they have heat sensors. There's a whole lot of things that you can do to see if people are sick. But going back to the other question too, I don't think they're going to be able to mandate vaccines. There's plenty of anti-vaxxers in this country who do not take vaccines. But one other aside, I will say there's over 800 products being used, being studied right now. There's a lot of therapeutics in place as well that are being studied. And I think 2021, you're going to see the advent of a whole new level of solutions moving forward for this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, with the therapeutics, it seems that, as you said earlier, getting COVID's no longer a death sentence, or less and less so. And I think as more, President Trump, an elderly fellow, recovered pretty quickly with therapeutics, probably reassured a lot of people.